Hello and welcome to this week's Realty Talk show. You know, there are cost impacts that are really easy to recognise as the ones that are going to add financial pressure to landlords, things like council rates, interest on borrowings and general property maintenance. But the ones that are not so obvious, like restrictive legislation and compliance requirements, are not always taken into account when assessing just how difficult it's becoming for investors to maintain their investment viability. Look, it is difficult on both sides, for landlords and tenants. No one's denying that. But don't for a moment overlook the potential for rooming or boarding houses. Bushy talks about that this week with Mark Baker. And Mark's a full-time property investor, rooming house specialist, and he's the owner of roominghouse.expert. And they specialise in the development, conversion and operation of rooming houses. Also this week in our ongoing special series on the importance of property management, we flip the table just a little bit and ask what separates great landlords from the rest in terms of achieving optimum property performance. Property management coach Hermione Gardner from Sidekick has a really interesting perspective on that, so all I can say is tuck your ego away and have a listen to her thoughts this week. Hey, before we start, I want to say a special thanks to our supporters and content partners, realty.com.au, BMT Tax Depreciation, Know How Property Finance, Get Rare Property and Apiro Marketing. And if this is your first time with us, welcome. You're going to find us on all podcast players and through the Southern Cross Austereo network. If you like the show, and I certainly hope you do, please hit that subscribe button and help us to continue to bring you the best guests every week. And don't forget too, you can join the conversation anytime on Facebook at the Property Hub Collective. Just search it, the Property Hub Collective. We'll be back in just a moment to start this week's show.
Property deductions can save you thousands of dollars each year. To make sure you maximise deductions, you need to work with the most experienced quantity surveyor in the country. BMT Tax Depreciation is the leading specialist in the industry. They've completed over 700,000 tax deduction schedules for residential investment and commercial properties Australia-wide. BMT guarantee to find double your fee in the first full financial year deductions. Call BMT on 1300 728 726 today for an obligation-free quote. Realty Talk and your host, Bushy Martin.
Now, it appears that everyone in housing is feeling the pinch at the moment. Interest rate rises, taxes and overall costs that are increasing at double to triple the rate of rising rents, alongside ever more restrictive legislation and compliance that are all squeezing out and making it increasingly difficult for landlord investors to maintain investment viability. Similarly, the drastic shortage of affordable rental housing, alongside skyrocketing rents, continues to make it progressively harder for tenants and renters to find rental housing and make ends meet. So what are the solutions? Well, one alternative form of rental housing that's making a strong resurgence under our current conditions is none other than rooming houses, or what used to be more commonly known as boarding houses. And here to open our eyes to this emerging opportunity is Mark Baker, a full-time property investor, a rooming house specialist, and owner of Rooming House Expert, who specialises in the development, conversion and operation of rooming houses. So welcome to the Property Hub's Realty Talk show, Mark.
Thanks for having me on.
Mark, love this subject and love what you're doing in this area. So I guess just to set the scene, can you talk us through what a rooming house currently is and how it differs from other types of rental properties?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like how at the start you mentioned, rooming houses making a resurgence, or boarding houses as they were traditionally known. Something that's been around for a very long time. Formerly there was like residential hotels as well, where it'd be higher end people who would live in there and have meals provided, linen serviced, all that sort of stuff, and live permanently in that type of setup. Obviously, as housing markets changed, the demographic dropped a bit, but that's coming back up with, as you mentioned, rental affordability. So to explain what a rooming house is, it's basically a building where you've got one or more than multiple tenancies under the one roof. And unlike in a share house where would be a group of people choosing to live together and deciding who uses what part of the house. In a rooming house, each person has an individual agreement and is responsible for the part of the house, i.e. their room that they have exclusive occupancy of, and the rest of the house is shared.
Got it.
Is enough of an explanation. Obviously, there's a lot of legal, stuff around that as well, but
no, and that sums it up pretty well. It's pretty succinct in that regard. So
Yep.
I guess given that context then, Mark, who are rooming houses best suited to then? And I want to look at this from both a landlord investor as well as a tenant resident perspective.
Okay, so if we talk about the tenants residents first, which is then going to be the market for the investors. Look, one that comes up a lot and a lot of people look at, and I'll get it out of the way first, is students. That's typically not been my market because it's more competitive and the margins aren't as good and stuff like that. So, and thankfully, over COVID, it wasn't my market because there wasn't a lot of students around. In other parts of the market, look, it spreads right through. There's key workers in areas that it might be on contract work for 6 or 12 months that just need something all inclusive. They've got bills included, the place is furnished, and it suits them. You've got people living longer term as well now in that type of market, right down to the I mentioned before, lower end, the welfare end of the market, where people who would otherwise be homeless. So that's your range. There's a full range, and that will depend a lot on what the product is, as well as where it is. So whether it's a converted property or a purpose-built property. Yeah,
makes sense. And so if we then extract that in terms of who's best suited to it from an investor perspective, where would you position it in that context?
Look, from an investor perspective, and this is shifting a bit, but from an investor perspective, it has typically been a later investment strategy, not something you want to get in too early because you can get a bit stuck, because typically they can be reasonably equity heavy. Financing is getting a little bit better now, and with commercial valuations coming in and things like that, it's starting to look like there's the ability to refinance and get some equity out, but that's going to be dependent on the figures going well. It's not typically an overly passive investment because you'll need to be a little bit more involved. There's going to be more running costs, more maintenance, more things like that happen. So you'd need to at least have a bit of an understanding, or be a little bit active, or have someone that that you can trust that can do that part of it for you, because it's not a set and forget. It's a bit more like, I suppose, a little bit more like a commercial type investment. So you'll see stuff advertised with the gross yields, but there's a lot more costs in running it.
Yes, good point. So it's probably still more a cash flow play than a growth play, or is it a bit of both?
Absolutely cash flow. And people sometimes like to try and have an each way bet and say, oh well, what's an area that's going to grow? Look, everywhere grows. Me personally, a lot of mine have been in regional areas, and I've had massive growth in those, but it was never my intent. It was always cash flow.
So the cash flow has been, the growth's been a bonus. It's the cash flow. And I guess because you've got multiple streams of income and you're not dependent on one tenant, it's going to plug some of those holes as far as that consistency of your cash flow is concerned.
That's actually a really good point.
Well, let's sort of pivot then into, and we've covered some of them already, but if you were to talk through the sort of pros and cons of rooming houses, can you do that again? And I want to look at this from both sides, from the landlord investor perspective, but also the tenant resident side, if we can.
Sure. Well, let's go residents first, because that's what we did first before. Look, I suppose some of the things, you're in closer proximity to other people. You may or may not like that. Personally, it wouldn't be my go, and it's probably not a lot of people's go either. So, there's sometimes things marketed on the point of, we're creating communities or whatever, but really, I don't know if you've ever gone and stayed in a ski lodge for more than a couple of weeks. How well are you getting along with the other people by then?
That's right, exactly.
There's the utopian idea and there's the reality. So look, that's the, I suppose, I mean, it can be a positive and a negative. I mean, you might find a group of people that you get along really well with that have got similar interests and stuff like that. Or it might be, look, just I want my own space, leave me alone. So some of that can come down to, again, how the house is designed and that. But So there's the plus and minuses with that. I mean, the affordability is probably a big plus for renters to go into that type of property. You're typically renting something that's furnished with bills included. You know, you have got your own private space, and there might be a shared area if you want to, you know, be around other people. It's generally going to be single people. So, you know, if you're on your own and, you know, you're looking for something affordable, that's going to be the sort of thing that's, you know, going to be in the range. Yeah, you can establish a rental history from that and potentially move on, or you might find you like it. Yeah. And you stay long term.
Yeah.
From an investor point of view, I mean, we touched on that too. It is cash flow. Me personally, I know people sometimes go and say, "Oh, what's the risk? What if I can't rent the rooms and things like that?" Me personally, I first went into rooming houses, and I was looking at it as a reduced risk, because from one property, instead of having one rent, there was multiple rentals coming in the one property. So even if everything wasn't full, I was still likely to be cash flow positive from it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, that's, to me, that's what I see as a benefit for investors.
Yeah.
You touched on capital growth before. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a growth play, but it can be a good way to afford to hold land in somewhere that, you know, would otherwise be costing you money, you know, for future use of the land. So sometimes it's good for a future development site.
Perfectly said. It's a very good point. It's a way of generating considerably higher income if you had future development plans for the site. As with every investment opportunity, there's always risks attached. And I guess I'm probably more focused on the investor risk for this question, if we can, Mark. What are some of the downside potential risks associated with rooming houses?
Look, I suppose some of the downside and risk is, you know, it can be a volatile market, so you can get reasonably high turnover. And whilst a lot of the stuff in the Residential Tenancies Act are fairly favourable towards, you know, rooming accommodation, as in, you know, there's often shorter notice periods and all that sort of stuff. The reverse is true, that the, you know, tenant obviously doesn't need to give much notice to move out.
Yeah.
So you can get a bit of volatility there. And where I mentioned before, interaction between people, if you get a problem person in there, they are protected by the Residential Tenancies Act as well, and can be challenging to move them on, and other people to be leaving as a result. So some of the risks there around, you know, how well that's managed, tenant selection, stuff like that. You know, it depends on the level of the market you're in as well. Like, you know, lower in the market, you could have a bit more risk of volatility and property damage and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Look, there are provisions in the legislation to do it, but you've got, like, that's where I said, you need to probably be active and understand some of the stuff to be able to deal with that.
Exactly right. It's knowledge is power when it comes to that. I know that a number of state governments are looking to tighten or review the legislation when it comes to rooming and boarding houses, etc. Is that a risk, or is that a positive? I'd love your thoughts on that. What are they talking about? What impact might it have in terms of those that might be interested in looking at this?
That's an interesting one, because, yeah, I think it's good when there's stuff that makes it clear. However, yeah, there's rarely times that government interference is a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, great.
But yeah, if it's stuff that makes it clearer, so you know, okay, this is what you can do. This is a standard that you need to provide. This is how you do it. Then I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I suppose we could touch on some of the things there, like Queensland, for example, have recently gone and expanded what was in Brisbane City Council and said, well, you can do it in every council now. However, in their stuff, they've got a 5 occupant limit. So it makes it hard to make money with only 5 people.
Yeah.
So, I think that needs to be increased a bit. And also, a lot of the councils up there are still charging pretty hefty infrastructure charges, which affects the viability too.
Of course.
Victoria has been doing it for a long time. We've got a reasonably good model. I know a couple of years ago, Western Australia was looking at Victoria, and things got put on the back burner. When we had a global pandemic, and I haven't seen them looking at it again, but I'm sure they will. ACT repealed regulations they had, and we're looking at bringing it back in, but again, haven't done anything. So I think having some good, sensible regulation makes sense, but I'm always a bit wary about how far governments go with their utopian views.
Totally agree. If it ain't broke, why try and fix it? is generally
Yeah,
my outlook on life on that. But again, sort of just to conclude the session today, Mark, for
sure.
those that are going, oh, this sounds interesting. What incentives are there for investors?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting one because there has been some come and go. There probably should be some more, and maybe that's where we need pressure on state governments.
Yeah.
I think Queensland are entertaining it at the moment because they have had massive issues with housing affordability recently. Rents have skyrocketed there, so they're potentially entertaining something. How far that goes, who knows?
Yeah.
New South Wales had some really good incentives and even grants available for about 10 years that ended a couple of years ago. So
Right.
that's sort of gone. They've still got the potential of land tax exemptions, and that's the biggest one in Victoria. There is land tax exemptions available, which I think is massive in Victoria now, given what's
Massive.
happened with land tax. But
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
so not massive amounts of incentives, but there's a couple.
Yeah, no, good to know. Well, look, we've probably only just scratched the surface today, Mark. So we'll get you back to talk more about the nitty gritties of the rooming house opportunity. But I just want to thank you for taking the time to open our eyes to the opportunity that's emerging. And clearly, there's some potential to assist the cash flows and reduce the risks for both investors and tenants alike. So I suggest that everyone who'd like to find out more reaches out to you at roominghouse.expert by clicking the link in the show notes. So thanks again for sharing all of this on the show today, Mark.
Alex, thank you. Looking forward to the next one.
Successful property investment is a game of finance. Do you have the right team and the right game plan? Realty Talk is brought to you by Know How Property. More than mortgage brokers, Bushy Martin and his team of investment architects set you up with a sustainable strategy structured to lower your costs, tax, risk and stress while increasing your capacity for growth. Know-how has helped over 1,900 homeowners and investors secure more than $800 million in property wealth. So get set to live more, work less and live your legacy. Want to know how to invest in your freedom? Visit knowhowproperty.com.au. This is Realty Talk, powered by realty.com.au.
And welcome back to our ongoing special series on the importance of property management. Now, as property investors, we're always looking at what our property team needs to be doing for us. But in my experience, relationships are always two-way, and each of us has actually got a pretty serious responsibility to think, act and behave in a way that allows the combined effort to achieve the best results. So it's the old story, when you're pointing the finger at someone, there's always at least three more pointing back at you. And this is particularly relevant in the property management of your property, as the property manager and your property's performance is only going to be as good as you and your approach will allow them to be. So today we're actually going to flip the tables and ask a recognised property management industry trainer and coach what separates great landlords from the rest in terms of achieving optimum property performance. And to do this, Hermione Gardner from Sidekick joins us again. So welcome back to the show, Hermione.
Thank you for having me again.
Hermione, yeah, this is a good subject because the heat's generally always on the property managers, but I want to turn it around today and reflect it back to the landlords to see what part they have in the performance of their property. So to start with, I want to go completely the other way and get you to share your experience across the board in terms of what a property manager might see as a nightmare landlord in terms of what they do and don't do. That makes it difficult for them in terms of their outlooks, expectations, attitudes and actions or non-actions as they may be. Can you sort of elaborate on that for us?
Of course. Well, I'm sure none of your listeners fall into this category. Of course, they're all amazing landlords. But I don't know. I don't feel like there's any nightmare landlords. I think that there's nightmare probably people, there's nightmare communication, there's nightmare relationships. And I think that, look, technically there are nightmare landlords out there, but I do think that when it comes down to it, it's usually a clash of what each party wants or expects from each other and a miscommunication and misalignment there. And I do think that a lot of the perception from a property manager's perspective of a nightmare landlord is actually just potentially a landlord who's had some really frustrating experiences, who is reacting a certain way, whether that's the right or wrong way to react. And a lot of property managers will label the same way in the other, flipping it the other way, where a landlord might think that all property managers are a certain way because of their experience. So I think that it probably comes down to, if I had to say, if I'm a property manager, wherever I had the most difficulty dealing with landlords, it potentially comes down to mainly if they don't want to follow the rules. So if they don't want to come to the party where legislation is concerned. So where I'm a property manager and I've got some boundaries I have to play within, and I have to manage the landlord, the tenant, the tradies. I have to meet all of that within the legislation. I have to keep all of those. I think you referred to it when we spoke last, the meat in the sandwich. Yes. I have to keep all of that going, right? And sometimes there are, there's landlords who aren't as familiar with the legislation, or maybe they are and they just want to cut corners, or they're tired and frustrated of having, so many costs and, restrictions imposed on them. And so I think, I wouldn't call it a nightmare, but it can be very challenging for a property manager where a landlord does not want to meet those legislative requirements, whether that's compliance or doing something throughout the tenancy that's not really considered above board. And it's actually, for many, many years, property managers maybe would just comply with it or go, oh, the landlord's, in charge. But now we're seeing that there's a lot of property managers who are what's called divorce landlords, where they're not actually meeting compliance, minimum property standards, depending on what state you're in. Like, if they're not meeting those requirements for their property, they're actually saying, hey, we actually don't want to take that on because it can cause too much of a risk for our business, but we're spending so much time going backwards and forwards with this client that it's actually, not beneficial or profitable for our business to have that client in place. So I'd say from that landlord's perspective, just remembering that property managers and you too as the landlord have to act within those legislation requirements. It's almost like an invisible thing that you didn't really sign on for when you bought an investment property, and you don't know a lot of the stuff. And especially I remember taking on new clients and I'd be like, oh, but also we have to do the smoke alarms, and also we have to do the blind cords, and also there's all of these extra things. And the landlords would get frustrated. I didn't realize there was so much involved in this. Now, a good property manager is very good at communicating and educating and understanding that, wow, the landlord's already had so many costs at this stage. I understand. And the delivery of that message is potentially different to where, potentially another one's like just getting frustrated because the owner doesn't want to pay for something else. Yeah. So I think abiding by the legislation is probably one thing that landlords really need to come to the party on, to not, I don't want to say be considered as a nightmare landlord, because I don't think that's the goal. We're wanting to really work out how we can work collaboratively together. But I'd say the other aspect is real estate, property, money is all very high stakes conversations. Yeah. It's going to be emotional. There's going to be emotion around it, even if it's our investment property, right? If we've got a property manager calling us and telling us that, the dryer needs replacing, and that's $1,000 that we don't have in our current budget. We are not budgeted and planned for that. It's going to be stressful. If I've also got, if I'm the landlord and I've had a shit morning with my kids and my mum's sick and I'm like trying to juggle it all, and that call comes in, I may not react the best to that call, and I may yell or be blunt or be critical of my property manager, because that's just the first person that's there on the phone that's getting my reaction for the day. But as we can't be in control of anybody else really but ourselves. So I would say that whether it's about your investment property and you're dealing with your property manager or in life in general, you're in control of your reactions. And if your cup is spilling over with those, negative reactions, it's probably not just that property manager. Like, it probably is a culmination of a lot of things going on for you, all of those financial pressures on top of all your life pressures and everything else. So sometimes just remembering that, and that remembering that property managers probably just trying to do their best, whether they're communicating it in the best way or possible, I'm not sure. But I think, as far as if I think about from a property manager's perspective, like, I would just want the person I'm dealing with to treat me with respect, whether I'm delivering good or bad news to them. Because I think the other air quotes, nightmare landlord traits would be landlords that are aggressive or reactionary, or that seem to fly off the handle at the smallest request or something that puts them outside of the norm of day-to-day property management. So I think it comes, but that's for all of us in life. We're all only in control of ourselves and our own reactions.
Yeah, extremely well said. And I think with the level of increased liability and compliance that's now required, and there's constant changes happening to the legislation right around the country in that regard, that smart landlords are going to recognise that the property manager is across the potential liability issues that are attached to that. And while they might grumble about having to spend the extra money, if they're trying to do that on their own, they're not even aware, and they end up getting sued for something that they weren't across, then I think the recognition the property manager has a professional responsibility and is potentially also liable if those things aren't followed through, then it starts to put a different perspective on things. So that's awesome. Let's sort of turn things around now and sort of from the other side of the equation. I'd love to get your thoughts on describing a much more ideal landlord from a property manager's perspective in terms of helping them to successfully manage their investment to everyone's benefit. Thoughts on that?
I mean, in just the opposite of what we were talking about, I think, a perfect landlord would, definitely be one that understands that we have to work within the legislation, that, even though sometimes we might feel frustrated in the moment, we're trying to work towards a bigger, more positive outcome overall.
Yep.
I think that a perfect landlord, if I had to describe it, would be someone that understands the costs of running and maintaining an investment property, and has actually budgeted for and planned for that cash flow, which I know is easier said than done. A lot of mum and dad investors are not, super flush with cash flow on their investment properties, not making money out of them, really stuck with a lot of them sometimes. But, if there is a possibility to have that, that mindfulness around that, so the landlord who kind of has a plan in place. I remember there's a lot of investors who end up with investment properties, whether that be accidentally, they've inherited them, or maybe they rushed in and got one because that's what everyone was doing, and now they're really struggling. I've got a really good friend who they own 2 investment properties, but they're beyond stressed and unable to kind of service both of those, and they're putting money into both of those properties to make them work. So it is stressful when a repair or something comes along, because that comes out of their, the kid's not doing sport that quarter, or they're not able to go on that family holiday that they've been planning. And there's a bigger purpose, obviously, but that can be really stressful. So where possible for a landlord to be as planned and understand that. But I think also it's around remembering that two-way communication. There is an onus on the property manager, I do believe, and this is something that the industry could do a much better job on, is communicating and educating with landlords so they understand, what potential costs might come up. That at the moment, a lot of the industry just leaves it up to the investor to know. But there's some pretty cool, things out there now where property managers can have access to tools where they can actually get assistance in mapping out, say, what a maintenance plan might look like, or what, the, tax depreciation might look like, and really helping them from that perspective. So if the property manager is demonstrating that, a really great landlord can build that trust with them and actually kind of trust them and let them to do their job as well. I think the other, we put the perfect air quotes in, it would be, for me as a property manager, it would be that you trust me to do my job and give you the best advice. But as a property manager, I have to earn that trust. I have to show you that I'm acting in your best interest, that I'm communicating with you, and I earned that right to have that respect. And when I was a property manager, it might have taken a couple of years of me managing properties for people until I could just say, hey, John, this has happened. Here's what I'm doing. And they're like, yep, Hermione, you've got it. Whereas a newer landlord who I hadn't managed before, we don't have that trust and rapport and relationship. So is that on the landlord? I don't think so. I think that the onus is on the property manager to build that trust, to give that education, to show that they're acting in the best interest, and being of value and an added benefit, right? If you're paying for this service, you want to be of added benefit in that person's life.
Yeah, beautifully said. And we've covered a lot of ground there, but are there any other do's and don'ts that landlords need to take into account when a property manager is looking after their investment that we haven't covered, Hermione?
Look, I don't know that there's any don'ts as such. Anything that someone as a property manager might say, oh, I wish landlords didn't do this. I don't know. I always think that as the service provider, like we need to listen to the landlord feedback, even if we don't like what it is, and actually redesign and improve our service to meet the needs of the landlords, of the investors. If I'd say if there's any other do's or don'ts, again, I think this should be on the property manager's side, is my true belief. But if there's any lack of clarity, or you don't understand what the property manager is talking about or what they mean, or you have any, misalignment in your head around like what the next steps are, is actually just like pick up the phone. A lot of communication now is done via email in the property management space. And that's because property managers want things in writing. They want the paper trail, which is fine. I encourage property managers to pick up the phone and have conversations, but also, like I would suggest from a landlord's perspective, if you're unsure or uncertain, is actually having a phone conversation, because 9 times out of 10, you'll resolve all of that in the space of like 3 minutes, as opposed to that back and forward. Now, I know that's hard because we're all so busy, but so again, sometimes just having that 5 or 10 minute conversation. Look, any other do's or don'ts? Look, as I said, remembering that the property managers on the other end of that line are human. People do make mistakes and overlook things. Give people the benefit of the doubt and opportunity to rectify. But if something doesn't feel right, or if something doesn't add up, I think it's like we spoke about last time. It was, say something, sit down, have a meeting with them and escalate that, because you're paying for a service. It should be right most of the time.
Yeah, extremely well said. And I think you make a very good point in this sort of digital age where we rely on technology to do the communication because we're trying to be efficient. I know that we've always operated on the rule that an email is a confirmation of a conversation you've actually had, not the first identification of what you're talking about. So I think there's some really, it almost sounds old-fashioned, but in terms of that relationship building piece between the landlord and the property manager, that quick conversation that you've mentioned, which is then it becomes a two-way communication, not a one-way communication, might feel like it's taking time, but in terms of reducing your overall impact down the track is gold. So look, some great points there. If you were to sort of summarise this whole exercise, Hermione, how can landlords better help property managers to get the best out of their investment properties? So
look, I think there is a lot of onus on the property manager to be working to improve this from their side. But to summarize, it's like what we've spoken about. It's having open communication with your property manager, picking up the phone to speak to them if you're confused or uncertain about something. I think being really clear with your expectations. I think all of us in probably general life can make assumptions, but being overly clear and over communicating with what you expect for them will not only then help them meet those expectations, but then it helps build the trust. And the next time it comes up, they know how to deal with things the way that you want them to be dealt with. A lot of different landlords have different ways they like things to be dealt with. It comes down to repair. You've got, landlords who are like, oh, you just do it. You've got some landlords who want 5 quotes on everything. You've got some landlords who are like, oh, Uncle Bob's going to do it for me. You've got some landlords who are like, I'm going to come and do it. So being really clear, again, I do think the PM should be asking those questions up front and determining that, but there's different circumstances for, different repairs and things that come up. So being clear in what your expectations are is going to go a long way to helping them deal with you in the way that you want to be dealt with. And then I think once that trust is built, like sometimes it's actually just getting out of the way and letting them do their thing. I think we can try and control things a lot, but if you have a really great PM, like sometimes we need to step out of the way, let them do their thing, trust them and take their advice, with that caveat of that trust has to be there.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing I would say is, like, if as an investor, like if you are struggling, like whether that be financially and you really are struggling to make ends meet or anything like that, it's actually having a proactive conversation with your property manager. you'd be surprised how many property managers just think that all investors are fine, they're pretty flush, they've got lots of money lying around, sitting on their golden toilets, with all their monopoly money. A really good PM knows that it's not like that. Yeah. But if you've got the trust and relationship there and you're struggling to make those mortgage repayments, is actually having a conversation with PM and finding out what can we do to, increase the rent, reduce some of the costs, like having that conversation with them, which I know that some investors will hold off doing because of, pride or the tall poppy syndrome, not wanting to talk about money and all sorts of different things, but they're there to help. And, I know I can specifically remember one landlord, they said, look, we're really struggling. We're thinking we might need to sell the property because we just can't make this work anymore. Yep. And a few simple changes we made, like we did an extra rent increase, that was reasonable to keep the tenants in the property, yep. Which actually then kept the tenants in the property, which saved them, the week or two of vacancy. We looked at some of the costs that they were paying regularly and ongoing and saw what we could reduce there. We, looked at their insurance. We saw how, we could reduce the cost of that. And then we put them in touch with a referral mortgage broker partner who looked at their mortgage and got them a reduced rate. And then within a couple of months, they could afford to manage their investment property. So a good PM will be able to help with that and point you in the right direction and have those conversations that, you might be too afraid or embarrassed or nervous to have because, you're the landlord and you should have it all figured out, but no one's got it all figured out. Like, use that expertise and let them help you manage your investment property.
Yeah, some great thoughts there. Really appreciate all of those insights, Hermione, which certainly reinforce the two-way mutual respect nature of successful property relationships and the need to help others in order to actually help yourself, which you've outlined very well, particularly when it comes to the mission critical nature of property management to the overall property performance. But before we go, I want to take this opportunity again to thank you for all of the great coaching and training work you're doing at sidekick.net.au to help property managers to grow and thrive to better serve their landlords and investors. So thanks again for joining us here on Southern Cross Austereo's Property Hub Realty Talk show, Hermione.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll do what I can on my side.
Are you curious about harnessing your super for property investment? Propel your future with the enlightening online seminar, The Ultimate Masterclass to Self-Managed Super Fund Property Mastery. Reserve your spot now at getrare.com.au/SMSF. Spearheaded by Rusty from independent buyers agency Get Rare Properties, this masterclass unravels strategic property investment using your self-managed superannuation fund. It's not just about learning. It's about transforming your financial future through education. So embrace this opportunity to enrich your investing acumen. Enroll now in the free masterclass and begin a journey that marries insight with action, leading to a financially empowered tomorrow.
Unlock bonus content now as a premium subscriber.
And that brings us to the end of this week's show. Make sure you don't miss any episodes of Realty Talk or Bushy's Get Invested podcast, both delivered to you every week. You can do that by subscribing to the Property Hub now on your favourite podcast player or wherever you are listening to or watching this show. Also, join the conversation anytime on Facebook at the Property Hub Collective. A special thanks to our supporters and content partners Realty.com.au, BMT Tax Depreciation, Know How Property Finance, Get Rare Property and Apiro Marketing. I'm Kevin Turner, and on behalf of Bushy and the Property Hub team, we look forward to seeing you again next week.